So, picture this. It's the early 13th century, and a holy war is declared. But wait, this isn't a crusade in some far-off land. No, this was a brutal 20-year war that pitted Christians against other Christians right in the heart of Europe. It was a conflict that would completely redraw the map of what we now call France. So, what does happen when Christians declare a crusade on, well, other Christians? This wasn't just some theological thought experiment. It was a brutal, bloody reality in a region of southern France called the Languedoc. And let me tell you, it kicked off a conflict so savage that it still echoes through that region today. This wasn't just about conquering land. It was a war to completely wipe out a way of believing. All right, so to really get our heads around this crusade, we have to start with the people it was aimed at. Now, they called themselves good Christians. The Catholic Church, they called them heretics. And today, we know them as the Cathars. Okay, so this is where things get really fascinating. You're looking at two completely different versions of Christianity. It's not just a small disagreement. It's like they were reading two different books entirely. For the Cathars, the whole physical world, our bodies, the earth, everything, was evil, a trap created by an evil god. And they actually thought this evil god was the God from the Old Testament. So naturally, they believed Jesus couldn't have had a real physical body. He was more like a phantom, a spirit who just looked human. You can see how this was a massive problem, right? It's a total rejection of the core tenets of Catholicism: creation, Jesus' divinity, the whole shebang. Now, at the heart of this Cathar faith were these incredible figures they called the perfects. Think of them as their spiritual superstars. And get this role was open to both men and women, which was pretty radical for the 13th century. These folks lived lives of extreme discipline. We're talking no meat, no possessions, no sex. They were trying to be as pure as possible. And this really stood out when you compared them to some of the, let's say, more worldly Catholic priests of the time. The perfects were the leaders, the guides, and only they could perform the one sacrament that really mattered to the Cathars, something called the consolamentum. It was like a spiritual baptism, the key to finally breaking free from the prison of the material world. So where did this faith take root? In a really special place called the Languedoc. You have to understand, this wasn't really France yet, not in the way we think of it. It was this vibrant, culturally rich region with its own language, Occitan, and famous for its poets, the troubadours. But the most important thing, it was a place of tolerance. Power was spread out among local lords, and these lords often just didn't care if their neighbors were Cathars. In fact, they often protected them. Communities were all mixed together. There's this great story of a Catholic bishop trying to get local knights to crack down on the heretics, and they basically told him, look, we can't. We grew up with these people. They're our family. Yeah, well, that culture of tolerance was not going to last, because down in Rome, the man in charge, Pope Innocent III, saw things very, very differently. To him, Catharism wasn't just some quirky local belief. It was a cancer, a deadly disease growing in the heart of Christendom that had to be cut out no matter what. And things went from bad to worse fast. For a while, the Pope tried sending preachers, talking it out. Didn't work. Then, in January 1208, everything changed. The Pope's personal representative, a guy named Pierre de Castelnau, gets into a huge argument with the most powerful nobleman in the region, Count Raymond of Toulouse, and right after, the legate is murdered. For Pope Innocent, that was it. That was the final straw. He basically declared a crusade, offering the Knights of Northern France an incredible deal, all the spiritual perks of fighting in the Holy Land, but right here at home, oh, and you get to keep the lands of the heretics you conquer. The Holy War had begun. Right in the middle of all this is Count Raymond VI of Toulouse. This poor guy is completely trapped. He's more of a diplomat, a patron of the arts, not a warrior. And he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. The Pope is screaming at him to persecute the Cathars, but these are his people, his neighbors, his subjects. He hesitates and bam, he's excommunicated, blamed for the murder, and his huge wealthy territory becomes the #1 target of the crusade. He's the perfect example of a southern lord caught between the worlds he knows and a pope who demands total obedience. And the man leading the charge against him? A completely different animal, Simon de Montfort. He was a northern French nobleman, and he was brilliant, he was ruthless, and he was fanatically religious. De Montfort truly believed he was God's instrument on earth. For him, this wasn't about grabbing land, though that was a nice bonus. No, this was a secret mission to cleanse the earth of heresy, and he was willing to spill any amount of blood to do it. So what followed was just horrific. The war Simon de Montfort brought to the Languedoc was brutal, on a scale that shocked even people in the Middle Ages. We're talking a campaign of terror, full of sieges and massacres, all designed to break the will of the people. The crusade kicked off with one of its most notorious episodes, the sack of the city of Béziers. The whole city was put to the sword. And this is where we get that absolutely chilling quote. The story goes that when a crusader asked the Pope's representative how they should tell the Catholics from the heretics, he replied, "Kill them all. The Lord will recognize his own." Now, did he actually say that? Probably not. Most historians think it's a legend. But the fact that people believed he said it tells you everything you need to know about the sheer terror this crusade inspired right from day one. But you know, the true horror of this war wasn't always in the heat of a chaotic massacre. Sometimes it was in the cold, calculated moments. And that brings me to a single number, 140. So what does that number mean? At the siege of a castle called Minerve, the Crusaders captured 140 Cathar perfects. They were given a very simple choice: become Catholic or die. Only 3 gave in. The other 137 chose the fire. And the accounts say they went willingly, even joyfully, to a giant bonfire that had been prepared for them. Some even threw themselves into the flames. This shows you this wasn't just a war against soldiers. It was a war against an idea, a systematic effort to literally burn a faith out of existence. After 20 long years, the war was finally over. Simon de Montfort himself was killed in a pretty ironic way. A rock from a catapult, supposedly operated by the women of Toulouse, hit him right on the head. So militarily, the Cathars lost. But the consequences of this war, wow, they went so far beyond the battlefield. Basically, the entire unique culture of the Languedoc was just erased. The local lords were gone, their lands swallowed up by the French crown, a huge step towards making France the country we know today. The local language, Occitan, was pushed aside for French, and the Cathar faith, it was hunted down to the very last believer by a terrifying new institution that was perfected during this war, the Inquisition. They were so thorough that almost all Cathar writings were destroyed. We only know their story because their enemies wrote it down. So here we are, 800 years later. You'd think this would all be ancient history, right? But the shadow of this crusade is incredibly long. The memory of that violence, that cultural destruction, it's left a deep, deep scar on the identity of southern France that people are still talking about today. And that leads to the big question that people still argue about. Was this a crusade, or was it a genocide? Was it a holy war that was really just a cynical land grab by northern barons? Or was it something much, much darker? A calculated attempt to wipe an entire culture off the map? The words we use today, like genocide, show just how raw this history still is for so many people. So why does any of this matter now? Because this crusade was a massive turning point. It helped create the centralized kingdom of France. It gave the world the blueprint for the Inquisition, a terrifyingly effective machine for enforcing belief. And maybe most importantly, it's just the stark, brutal warning from history about the dangers of religious intolerance, about what can happen when people are so sure they are right, so sure they are doing God's work, that they can justify anything. And that leaves us with this really challenging thought. Remember, both sides called themselves the good Christians. Both sides. One group was essentially erased from history, while the other built a nation on its ashes. So it forces us to ask, how do we remember a war like that? A war fought over the very nature of God, where good Christians killed other good Christians. And what does it tell us about what happens when faith becomes a weapon? Not just to save souls, but to completely destroy them?